to a talk which I have never given before and I'm never going to give again. We're going to explore, ladies and gentlemen, the life of Brian. I may say that was me playing the piano in the background. This is Brighton, on the south coast of England, which is where my father comes from. And this is Brighton in 1860. Apart from the traffic, not a lot has changed. And it's from then that the earliest family photographs that we have dates. My father's great-grandparents sitting on the beach at Brighton. There's a wedding photograph with the loving couple in the middle. There's my dad, my mum and my dad in the middle of that picture. My father's got his arm around someone else. I never knew who she was. I think my mother knew, though. And that is the young Brian. I know you've all been longing to see that epoch-making photograph, and there it is. As a kid, I loved picnics. I adored planes. I was never happier than when fishing or mucking about in boats on the water. It was always an attraction. And that's the house we lived in North London, with splendid castle-like battlements on one end. This was the family gardener, Mr. Brimley. When I was 7, my dad took these first films of me. We'd go down to Brighton to stay with the relatives, and I'd go to Black Rock swimming pool. Those are the White Cliffs, going away towards the White Cliffs of Dover. I don't think my Olympic potential was fully brought out then. This is where my mother lived, in Padstow, and I went back later to make a television film, because the ferry boat and the harbour had changed remarkably little, and I thought other people might like to know about it.
Small fishing village of Padstow, crouched in a cove that meets the estuary of the River Camel. With its back to the wind, this unspoiled settlement is sheltered, and its harbour is protected.
Now, my father took this photograph before we all went off to a family wedding there in my dark jacket. Then he got his cine camera out, and I thought, no, this is cine. It's supposed to be moving. We need some movement in it. So, in order to give him some animation, I started jumping up and down and waving, saying, come on, Dad, let's have some movement. But he loved filming the bays in Cornwall, and when I made my programme down there, I loved filming them too. It's a lovely part of Britain. In the summer, the sea is warm. It comes wafting straight up through the Gulf Stream from the Caribbean. And Dad used to love to take pictures of us down there when I was playing with boats or climbing up on the sand dunes. It was a great adventure to go down to Cornwall to my mother's family home. I loved camping. This is in our garden at home, and that's Christmas when I was 8 years old, and I still remember that tin plate yellow aircraft to this day. In the summertime, you'd find me making photographs or doing drawings of wildlife. And when I was 10, I was in the newspapers for the first time, having won a poster competition. There I am, you'll see in the top photograph on the left, holding my poster and looking rather startled. But it was great. It meant I had a bike. That's riding it down through the old house. That's how the old house was when we used to go and visit it, but the last time we saw it, it was boarded up and was since demolished and replaced with something more modern. And we moved to East Anglia, where there was plenty of space for swimming and for going fishing, and we'd always go for regular trips on the Norwich Bell, this lovely little steamboat. The engineer used to let me go down into the engine room and help him check the lubrication and the functioning and the pressures. Can't do that these days. I won some little awards for science, and in the centre there, during a dress rehearsal, played in the school plays, and my first publication ever was when I was 14. In school, I became fascinated by optical instruments, and I also wrote an amusing article, a funny article called The Whole Truth, which set out to explain, as a joke, that matter didn't exist. What we needed to discover was the importance of the whole between matter. And indeed, I said at the end, they can be obtained at any wholesalers. Did a number of April Fool's gags, and this one was one where I said that our local meadows were going to be flooded to produce a specially genetically modified form of rice. The locals were horrified. Didn't realise it was published on the 1st of April. I said the scheme was the brainchild of a great Irish agronomist, Dr. Patrick Fields, known to his friend as, of course, you will have worked out as Paddy Fields. I sometimes did April Fools also on TV.
The scientific world is tonight holding its breath and trying to digest the the impact of Brian J. Foerd's latest discoveries about the very meaning of matter.
It has now been discovered that solid objects, planets, rocks, cars, wombats, don't matter as much as the space in between them. This amazing new theory means that matter only exists as the space between the holes. For years we've known of physical matter and antimatter, and now we're faced with a new concept of doesn't matter. From ancient times to the present day, we have celebrated the existence of holes. A net is only a bundle of holes tied together with string. Lace workers from ancient times used complex programs to link delicate arrays of holes together with silk, creating fractal patterns. In the modern world, a lot of manufacturers are already packaging holes. Here they are packaged in a carbohydrate matrix. This is the more traditional pasta. There are reconstituted potato holes here, and of course, a traditional form of holes packaged within cheese. These little candies are really holes, and when you get down to it, even these little chocolate goodies are almost entirely holes. Every new road is covered with a layer of tiny holes. Well, of course, this is an example of a little-used road, and here we see a fascinating phenomenon. The tiny initial holes run together like droplets on a misted window and coagulate to form what we in science know as a pothole. Now, this is a specimen of a worn car tyre. We used to think that as the car tyre begins to get smooth like this, that rubber was wearing off. But now we realise what is actually happening is that a layer of hole is being pressed onto the surface of the tyre. And we know this must be the case. Were it otherwise, the roads of Britain would now be covered with 4.27 metres of powdered rubber. But in fact, there is no rubber dust whatever on the roads of Britain. Holes are everywhere on the planet. Take as an example this solid-looking pillbox. It was built in the Second World War and, of course, constructed on the surface of the ground as it then was. But in the following decades, farming, tillage of the soil, has brought a layer of holes to the surface, until the present-day landscape is 9 feet lower than it was just 50 years ago. This perpetual loss of hole is posing problems wherever we look. The whole world is contracting. Little wonder, in an era where computers are doing the work, we ourselves are working harder than ever before. Our whole world is shrinking.
Incredible. Well, Brian J. Foerd is actually in the studio with us. Brian, it is an amazing theory. We all have these holes around us, don't we, all the time? And in fact...
well, we don't. I mean, in my house, we keep everything in perfectly good order. I mean, some people do have holes everywhere.
Well, I was just... Normally, you see, I probably would have thrown these away.
But
these, presumably, are something worth hanging on to
well,
now.
I mean, as a scientific specimen, these would be perfectly viable to keep in the laboratory, but I really don't think you want them on the family programme. That's not quite...
I'm sorry about that. Well, I was just sort of giving an example of a hole there.
No, you don't need to look so far for examples. Just before I came here to the studio, I had a call from the University of Fairloop, which has conclusively proved that this new proposal is in fact viable.
Where actually is the university?
Fairloop. Out in the Far East, it's near Guadeloupe, but a little bit up and to the left.
Right.
It's a bit of a hole, really.
Why have we not discovered this until now?
People, that's an absurd question, even for an experienced television presenter, I have to say. Things like survival of the fittest, gravity, until somebody had been wise enough to point out these ineffably complicated relationships in science, people never had seen them. But once the idea was out there in the open, it was perfectly simple and clear for everybody to see.
It's funny, wasn't it, to think that one would write an article about the whole truth as a kid, and then when the television news people suddenly said, would you like to have a film crew to make an April Fool's gag? I said yes, and they said, what would the subject be? And my mind went straight back to school. Some of the words I used when filming were the same as I'd written when I was a teenager. And my father used to officiate at events and see the cloud of cigarette smoke. He gave up smoking cigarettes and within a year bought a touring caravan, which he parked down at the seaside, a place called Swanbridge, a place we came to know very well. Here's my mother with her mum. I think some of the only movies that we actually have of Mrs. Biddick. I, meanwhile, as a teenager, was busily studying down the microscope, got some of my earliest, rather amateurish studies of microbes, and I built this device, Fred, photomicrographic recording and enlarging device, and took my very first, rather clumsy photographs down the microscope of microorganisms when I was a teenager. We picked up signals from Sputnik 1 when the Russians launched the first satellite, and as the Secretary of the Science Society, I used to get films in. I also found recently my first ever lecture notes for a lecture on bacteria when I was 16 years old, and they've since been published in a paper, so although I'd lost them for all those years, they're not going to get lost now. I didn't want to go to university. I thought they were backward looking, and I thought they were narrow in their scope. I didn't think they brought out the best in you as they should. So I went to the Royal Infirmary, joined the Medical Research Council as a very junior researcher, and studied, among other things, fluid flow. I became particularly keen on the way in which blood flows, and also the way that blood flows as it's clotting. The camera with which I took pictures in those early days was actually from a wartime Spitfire aircraft. It was a bomb aimer's camera, one of the cameras that took pictures when a target had been destroyed. But with it I was able to film the way in which blood coagulated, and you see those little tiny threads that hold the blood cells in position as blood clots. And this became quite an important discovery. It was published in the medical press. It was later published in technical journals, and then to my enormous surprise one day, it appeared in the International Yearbook of Science and Technology, which had all the highlights of the year. And there was my photograph as a highlight from that year, published opposite a picture sent back from the moon. Could you imagine how excited I was to think that my humble discovery could ever be rated as highly as that? My research has been more recently published in present-day journals. And at that time, I began writing a weekly series of science articles. I persuaded the editor of our local newspaper that science was going to be of the future, and so started to write my column of Science and You. But later university did beckon. I went back. There's Jan and I at one of the events there, and I did some good work on this early plant called Rhynia, one of the first plants ever, but the cells of which it is comprised can still be seen. And I also made some pretty good studies on this rat embryo. You can see under high magnification even the cells of which it's made. It's a wonderful specimen. Once you've looked at this rat section, you can see even on the right the kidney and the adrenal. You can actually envisage the size of the cells that comprise the fetus, and you never think of yourself in quite the same way again. But I didn't find university satisfying, and I went to see my head of department and discussed with him the way that it seemed to me that universities worked.
I study a certain thing and get a PhD. He said, yes. And then when I'm 80, I'm the world's greatest ever certain thingologist. And he said, yeah, that's how the system works. I said, well, I don't want to do that. I want to do a certain thing for 4 or 5 years, and then something totally different, and other things at the same time. And also I want to write about science and broadcast about science. And he said, look, if you're a scientist, you can't do the media. And if you're a PhD, you have to study and specialise in one specific thing. That becomes your lifetime's work. So I thought, well, the only way to do this is to have my own lab and do it my own way. So I did. And often people imply, as you just did, that it was a very brave and forward-looking thing. No, it wasn't. It was stupid, it was irresponsible, and it was completely arrogant. It's just good fortune that it seems to have worked.
And on hindsight, now it becomes brave, and because it worked out.
And among the other things that I liked doing was playing blues and boogie piano. And that has even been written about in a book on the history of music in South Wales. Those were great days, they were. I may say the playing was more exuberant than accurate. But back in my early 20s, in fact it was 50 years ago exactly that I did my first ever television appearance, playing piano in a series with a man called Tom Jones, who I believe has some celebrity as a singer. By this time I was married, one married young in those days, and we had 3 kids. We had some of the greatest fun ever with the kids. I must say, having kids is the most expensive hobby you'll ever have, but it's certainly by far the most enjoyable. And of course they love to travel. I would take them to, in this case, the north coast of Belgium, where of course the family love of playing about in sand dunes still remained very evident. And to be able to feel free to go and explore a different culture always seemed to me to be terribly important. My first wife calling the kids in to come and have their evening meal in our seaside chalet, and to just go somewhere with the kids and expose them to a different culture always seemed to be so important. They loved going to Paris. They first went to Paris when they were really very young, and they always found, here we are having lunch at the Louvre overlooking the old courtyard, they always found the exposure to a different language, to an alien way of life, somehow liberating. They learned far more doing that than they ever would in school. We went to see the sights in Paris and Notre Dame. Jan and I were there just before the pandemic, seeing the way that this beautiful spire had been destroyed by fire, and it's so good to think that they're going to try and recreate it. We love visiting the little villages, the little coastal villages on the coast of France, and of course going by air out to Spain and to the Balearics. This was a visit to Mallorca. Loved doing that. Indeed, it was on a trip well over 50 years ago, as by then a single parent family, those early marriages are not destined, are they, to last, that I and the 3 kids happened to bump into Jan. And I'm pleased to say that she's managed to keep me organised ever since. She's largely the reason why I'm standing here fully clothed, relatively coherent, and in position of the right presentation at the right time. Going overseas liberates the soul. You all know that, that's why you're here. And the fun that we used to have just by getting in a plane or going on a boat and going somewhere, that pleasure has never died down. In my 20s, of course, most of my travel was proper serious travel for business or for academic purposes. This is Heathrow as it used to be. In those days, of course, the planes were very different. Most of them were propelled by propellers and not by jets, and they didn't fly very high. So all of those aircraft in the early days had much bigger windows than they have nowadays. On this occasion, as we crossed the coast, I was flying to Luxembourg for talks with the people who were founding what became the common market. And one would go to official meetings and be enthusiastically briefed about how wonderful Europe was going to be. And I used to think, well, a common market makes great sense. But a European Union seemed to me to make no sense at all. After all, the cultures of the different countries are so very different and so very disparate. And the country that's your friend one minute, as we are now discovering, might not necessarily be very, very reliable later on. But I wrote extensively on my doubts about the idea of the common market. And this photograph was taken with a man called Louis Jans, who was what became the common market's chief spokesman. And my grandson George, 50 years after this, took me back to the same place so that I could recapture those memories. And so there we are, with Brian aging in a quick 50 years by courtesy of George. I was, of course, writing articles in my 20s. In 1968, my first article appeared in the Times, and I wrote for them on a range of subjects, but all the time I was continuing my scientific work. I made some very early films of microorganisms. The modern biological world is transfixed by genes, and chromosomes, and mitochondria, the bits inside cells. I wanted to see how did cells actually behave as entire organisms? How do they talk to each other? How do they communicate with each other? Some of the microbes were made of dozens of cells, like this rotifer. Some others were made of thousands of cells, like this hydra, with its little bud forming on the side. And we could see under high magnification exactly how it was that it attracted and held on to its food. And some, like this head louse, were made of millions of cells. See in its body how its intestine pulsates, it's sucking blood from the back of my hand. Although even looking at head lice is enough to make those of us with hair feel quite itchy about the scalp, they are actually very beautiful organisms under the microscope. And these pictures were published both in medical journals and later in encyclopedias and in magazines. They were very revealing photographs of what head lice are actually like. I also was brought in to analyse skeletons. I want you to listen to the recording I made at the time that these skeletons were being filmed, because you can hear at that time I was very asthmatic, and you can hear the way I find it difficult sometimes even to breathe at that time.
There's Joanna lying in the ground, her little knobbly knees that hadn't seen the light of day for about 1,000 years, right up to her little happy face. There's the cast of the inside of her brain with a little lump, showing where she must have had some form of tumour. And there's the spike. It fits absolutely perfectly right into the little hole. So we'll just complete the assembly now. Not a very nicely developed piece of film, rather scratchy and blurry, but I had to develop it in a bucket. And there was Joanna reconstructed for the first time with her little feet on the carpet. Under the microscope, there's one of the ribs, and we came across these little fragments of metule, which we could dig out. There's a little fragment. Anyway, there we are, that's 1967, and that is the end of that.
Interesting, because it meant that one had found a murder weapon When I found a possible motive, because she'd had this growth in her brain, she might have acted strangely, and even found these little fragments of iron in the ribs showing she'd been attacked. The research was later published in a UNESCO book and became a reference work for the best way to extract and analyse skeletons. But that lure of communism remained. I was so interested to try and get to know some of the people who were opposed to communism or working against it, and used to travel in the middle 60s over to East Berlin, to the centre of the German Democratic Republic.
This is the Hotel Unter den Linden in the middle of East Berlin, and at the end of the Unter den Linden, the Brandenburg Gate, which marks the way to the west.
That's on the eastern side, of course, with policemen keeping a careful watch. You're not supposed to take photographs in those days anywhere near the wall, but everywhere you went, there was this wall. And you know, even though the wall came down and the two Germanies were united, their culture has never really joined.
Here's the official car, the Russian Tatra, which takes one on official visits. Friedrich, on this occasion, is the guide and interpreter. And so to Dresden.
Very interesting visits. They were building then the famous television tower, which now, of course, is the symbol of Berlin. People forget the fact that it was actually built by the communists. But some of these people that I met then have since been to visit us, since the two Germanies became united, been to visit us at home.
I flew across the Prague.
I went down to Czechoslovakia.
Where good King Wenceslas were hiding when the Russian troops opened fire.
When the Russians had come in, that was an extraordinarily difficult time for them, but those brave people fought through. But I was broadcasting a lot on radio, and I've always enjoyed doing radio. To me, radio is more visual, more stimulating than television.
Well, my first guest is science writer and broadcaster Brian Foerd. Brian, let's start at the beginning. When and who first developed these sort of non-soap detergents?
It actually dates back to the time of the First World War, when Germany couldn't get supplies of raw materials. So her scientists began to look for ways of making industrial alternatives for soap.
Question to the scientific community: where are you taking us? It's introduced by Brian Foerd.
Tonight we consider the problem of filling the energy gap. Our civilization is founded on power. Power of authority, power in politics, the power of the sword, and the power of technology. Without energy for industry, our civilization would collapse. It's 11:30. Science Now. With Brian J. Foerd. Good morning. And today we visit the Mid-Atlantic and Japan, talk about arthritis, and hear some thoughts on how little we still know about pain.
Philippa Gregory and the scientist and writer Brian J. Foerd. Here's your first question. On her own, this lady is witty and also outgoing, but as soon as she acquires a niece or nephew, she becomes a target for abuse. She can make a delightful cake and sing a colourful shanty, and she's handy at campanology too. Who is she?
She's Sally, because she's witty. I mean, she therefore can offer a sally in discussion. She's outgoing, so she sallies forth. When she becomes an aunt, she's an Aunt Sally, which is a target for abuse. The cake must be a Sally Lunn. Philippa.
And I think it's the colour on the end of the rope.
That's right.
Gosh, how clever.
More or less, that gives a grip for the bell ringer.
Mm-hmm. And the colourful shanty, it's something like Red Hot Sally, isn't it? Because of the colour notion in it.
No, it's not that.
Is Sally in the title?
Yes, it is. It's a nice, simple name. Or...
Jones.
No, a colour.
It couldn't possibly be Sally Brown.
It could actually be Sally Brown, yes. Apparently has many obscene verses.
Used to enjoy doing radio programmes so much, and then my greatest delight ever was walking into a store and somebody saying, "Oh, I recognise your voice from the radio." People recognise it from the television, and I find it very irritating. I want to say, go away and do something sensible. But people who've been listening to the radio are engaged. And let's have a look at two little clips, 50 years apart. The first time that I appeared on ITV News, national news in England, followed by the last time that I appeared on it.
A Cardiff scientist, Brian Foerd, believes the cause lies in the tip itself.
The principle of it is quite simple. In a coal tip, the material runs up a kind of railway, on a track of some description. Usually, of course, this railway runs on the surface of the tip, and the material discharges into a large conical pile. The angle of this is critical and is known, here it is, for obvious reasons, as the angle of repose. It depends on the way in which the different particles within the mass are pressing on the particles beneath them, and this depends on their density. When a mass becomes filled with water, saturated with liquid, the density of each particle is less. Therefore they press less heavily upon each other. The effect of this is to lessen the angle of repose. The only way this can happen is by the whole tip losing height, spreading out at its base, and, in effect, sliding down onto the surrounding countryside. With this device, one can introduce water into a dry imitation of the slag. At a certain critical stage, the whole thing slides away. A rather terrifying example in miniature of what happens when a tip collapses.
Yes, television was always fun. I've enjoyed doing it. Anyway, let's go forward 50 years.
It was listed as a weird drawing instrument, but one man just thought he might recognise it, bringing to an end his long quest for the holy grail of microscopes, and he was right.
Brian Foerd, a biologist who's spent his life searching for original Leeuwenhoek instruments.
Historians of science thought, hang on a second, those little 3 holes in that handle, that's typical of a Leeuwenhoek microscope. And indeed, that's what it turned out to be. It was originally selling for $99 on eBay. It's probably now worth $250,000.
Leeuwenhoek's microscope showed people a world they'd never known. Biologists are still exploring that world today. Alok Jha, ITV News.
Amazing stuff.
But, of course, I used to continue writing newspaper articles. Newspaper articles are a very great way of bringing thought and new ideas to an interested public. In the 70s, I did my first ever world lecture tour, 38 stopovers in 2 months, starting with India. The Indian astronomers were quite extraordinary and did some really detailed early observations. I lectured on genetic engineering and the democratization of science, and went to see the first experiments of actually putting solar panels on a roof. It seems quite common now, but that was when it just began. And I was filmed by Indian television in order to talk about science for their public. Being filmed in those days, of course, is much more complicated than it is now. In Thailand, I was taken out to spend the weekend with the Dean of Science at his traditional family home out in Ayutthaya, and to discover the way in which people lived in those far-off days. And then, of course, flying across the Atlantic, notice that the planes in those days didn't have lockers up above, an open shelf on which you would put only something soft like your coat or your hat or your gloves. But travelling across the world took me to the other end of the world, to Melbourne in Australia, where I also appeared on TV to talk about some of the controversies they were experiencing over pollution, and flew with Richard, young pilot friend, up along the fabled Gold Coast so that I could go to Queensland and explore their tropical rainforest. It gave rise to a theory of mine on why plants lose their leaves, and that research has resonated with me ever since. In Tonga, I discovered the wild versions of where you get a pina colada from, and had enormous fun in trying to understand the way that tropical ecology worked, and studying the way in which the local people spent their lives. Down on the beach, I was able to get out into the protected lagoon, shielded from the Pacific swell by banks of coral, and become acquainted for the first time with life under the sea on a coral reef. That visit to Tonga was a very important part of my maturing as a biologist. For the first time, I was face to face with tropical ecology, and also these monstrous fruit bats, flying foxes. They were extraordinarily interesting, and I often thought how good it would be to study them. But then getting into a little plane packed with massively overweight Tongan rugby players and squished in, tighter than you can possibly imagine, flying across the Coral Islands. I went to New Orleans to celebrate Mardi Gras. That was absolutely wonderful. and flew from there on to Houston. I went to a do at the Astrodome. The Houston Dome at that time was the biggest dome in the world, and it was really quite exciting to go and visit it. I explored a lot in California, took the chance to go and see relatives, cousins who lived in Stockton, and of course headed for the city so that I could spend some time in San Francisco itself and get to know that great city. I had my bank account in San Francisco for decades. And then of course I was flying back, again those great big windows that you had on those early planes, flying back over London, and occasionally one was invited, if someone recognised you, to go into the pilot's cabin, and you could take a seat with headphones on, and so I was able to actually take film of Terminal 3 at Heathrow from the inside of the cockpit, and then back home to give all the news to Stuart and Sarah and Tony and Jan, and to tell them the various adventures I'd had on my trips. Those were great days and intense days filled with work. But it wasn't all work. Just half an hour from where we lived was this little island. It's half a mile long, half a mile off the shore, and so we would go down there throughout the summer. Sully Island, lovely little place, and sometimes go over there and get marooned and have barbecues. But this was just half an hour away from our Cardiff home. So we could pop down in the evenings, we would spend summer holidays down there. It was idyllic, it was almost like being overseas. The sea was warm, the coast was uncluttered, it was uncrowded. We had this wonderful little shelf for diving off, and we'd have al fresco lunches with our mobile home right by the sea. This is when Jan's parents came down one day to stay with us and visit us and have an al fresco lunch. It was always so enjoyable to know that at home there was all the work, and if I went down, there was all the relaxation.
Sometimes I even get some work done.
But not often. Although I did on occasion have people say, "You're going to come to London." This is my editor, Sam Llewellyn. He'd say, "Come to London and lunch," and I'd say, "No, you come down with me. Come down to the seaside. We'll do all the proof checking by the sea." And we really were right by the edge of the water. To have that break when the family was so young was wonderful. I was still, of course, writing articles for the London newspapers. These were for the Guardian. Many of them actually looked ahead at topics that are now becoming quite popular. At the time, they were groundbreaking. These days, of course, they're now old news. It was also 40 years ago that I first arranged for Jan to come with me on the QE2. She had a birthday, and I thought, well, I'll secretly arrange a little trip on the QE2. We loved it, and found that the QE2 was, without doubt, the best way of going to America. We found her so much a home from home. And of course, on that grand old line, and I'm sure many of you knew her too in the old days, there were shops, there were restaurants, there was endless entertainment, and one met people. You know, looking back at these old films from 40 years ago, I remember meeting these people. Photographs were taken on board because, of course, people didn't have a mobile phone with cameras in. And so, unless the photograph was taken, you had no real memory of the trip. Now, looking back on them, you've only got to look at the picture, and back come all those floods of memories. And then, of course, dining on these ships was always such a relaxing and enjoyable experience. And we always went to the lectures. We never missed a cruise lecture. Never entered my head that one day I might be the person up on the stage. And I was also lecturing in America. I found the other day an old tape of the first time I ever spoke in America, 40 years ago.
It's a rare privilege that we have to encounter a character like this. There aren't many in history that if you try to go back and think of anybody like Brian Foerd, DJ as some people call him, I have a hard time thinking of anyone else that would approach his interest in life and culture and science and his ability to present it. This is a man who not only writes interestingly and well, but speaks in a similar manner. We can take lessons from how he does what he's going to do tonight. I think it will be a unique contribution to our program.
Stop saying that. We'll say we're building it up to an astronomical height.
I'm trying to make it difficult for you, Brian.
Let anybody who wondered where Chicago got the name of the Windy City from,
My God, it's a lamp! Oh! Yes, I was supposed to have a day to recover from jet lag. I was originally scheduled, I beg your pardon, to be on tomorrow night, but I was slid forward because somebody is going to be giving away ice cream tomorrow, all of which shows to my mind what a splendid sense of value and proportion.
One of the most important rules when you lecture is to start on time. On one occasion, there were technical difficulties and I had to start 5 minutes later. Well, there's an obvious answer to that, ladies and gentlemen, isn't there?
Good morning, everybody, and I'm very sorry we started a bit late, so I'll go a little bit faster than I would, because otherwise I'm not going to get through the entire thing, but I'm going to finish what I could read. I mean, we had this step clicking with all the stones and various things and so on. So I shall give the lecture exactly what it's going to be, but of course I have to see that just a little bit, and I hope very much that you don't lose any of the actual sense of it, because it's very important that you try to get the general nuance, even if the occasional word falls by one side, which of course inevitably happens if you happen to start a little bit sooner.
Well, I didn't keep it up, you'll be glad to know. But lecturing on a cruise ship is interesting. It takes you to interesting places, brings you in contact with interesting people, and of course, being an author, there are always book signings very often on board ship.
They were in fashion, they were out of fashion, and they come back in again. Put them in the drawer for a while. Oh, thank you.
And one thing we don't have any time to talk about this evening are my books. These are they. There are, I think, 140 editions of my books out around the world. The latest one is called Nonsense Returns. It's a book, won't surprise you to know this, it's a book that rather pokes fun at the way science is being conducted at the present day. But I often talked about my work on TV. Over the years I've done an incredible range of TV programmes. Here's, from 40 years ago, a programme on French TV when they put subtitles over me and left me in English. And more recently, they had some very young and dashing and sexy actor to come and read my words instead, which is always been
words, of which there are many. Brian J. Foerd. A scientist generally, but more specifically, I read, though I hesitate to pronounce, a microscopist.
People never get that word right. I wonder why that is.
What is it then?
Microscopist.
Microscopist?
A microscopist, yes.
At the time, Brian Foerd was a young scientist and writer, working in Cardiff.
One of my chums rang up and said, "We've got a case here that would interest you. We've got smallpox virus in South Wales." I was utterly astonished. Smallpox was still a well-known disease. There were 60,000 cases in 1962 around the world, but nobody expected it would be here.
If you want an example of looking really into the future, then look at the amazing designs of Eugen Sanger. This man had a plan for what he called an antipodal bomber. It could fly to the Antipodes, the other side of the world.
And tonight I welcome you to the Architecture Club. We meet all over the place. We've met on a boat in the Thames, we've met in Buckingham Palace. Tonight we're in Carlton House Terrace looking at a magnificent restoration of a 19th century Georgian building.
Brian, you're a scientist. You deal in cold, hard facts. Can feng shui stand up to scientific scrutiny in any way?
Well, there's never been any scientific scrutiny. That's the reason that we can't answer that. All this to know, who did you go to?
On the radio.
On the gardening program.
On the gardening program.
I love doing that show. And I saw you on the telly doing that quote program.
And this week our guest comes from Cardiff. He's a prolific writer on all matters of scientific kind, and his book, The Cult of the Expert, has just come out in a German edition. Let's see if he can successfully baffle our panel with his question. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Brian J. Foerd. Hello, Brian. Right. Now, Brian has a gentleman he'd like the two panels to try and identify. Here's your first picture clue coming up.
An Irish heath with celestial yearnings. Am I right in thinking, by the way, that we have now clinched for His Royal Highness to come in September? November, isn't it?
And indeed on fish conservation.
Oh, that's good.
So that he will be with us on the 30th of November.
This
scientist Brian Foerd offered us his stripy jacket, his bow tie, and his thoughts on finding winning numbers.
Hello, I'm Brian Foerd, and as a scientist I find there's one question I keep being asked about the National Lottery. It is, of course, should you keep using the same sequence of magic numbers week after week, or change them each time you fill in your card? The reasoning behind it is this.
Why the leaves drop. Professor Brian Foerd believes it's a tree's way of getting rid of waste matter.
They're not dying, they're doing something. If a tree contains, heavy metals and other toxins, they get pumped into the leaf before the leaf is fallen. So my theory is very simple. When the plant drops its leaves, that is the plant's mechanism of excretion.
It's not the whole answer, and I've learned some more science today. I'm very excited about it. Professor Brian Foerd from the Cambridge Society for the Application of Research has taught me a new word: excretophore. Shortly before they're shed, levels of potentially harmful components such as tannins, oxalates and heavy metals accumulate deliberately in the leaves. So basically, leaves shedding from the trees, that's like dumping the tree's toxic waste onto the ground. These are organs that are excretophores, and he goes on to say the trees are having their annual excretion. Brian, top work.
They both felt that if we want to advance our knowledge, we can do whatever we want to these people. And both of those great enemies of the West in World War II had that single underpinning of an attitude of unassailable superiority, which led them both to carry out appalling acts against their fellow human beings.
Now, in Cambridge, England, Professor Brian Foerd has developed an idea that might explain it.
I set out to search for a compound in the body that could burst into flame.
Fran Elliott, off-gas public affairs manager, and Brian Foerd. I think we need a roll on the drums. The brainiest man in Britain, tipped to be the next.
But how does a person burst into flame?
To make him less aggressive. Scientist and author Brian Foerd came across the plan in a batch of declassified documents.
The problem is, of course, that people will say insect protein, oh, that's horrible. But hang on a second. Insects are arthropods. They've got an exoskeleton. Well, so have prawns, so have lobsters, crabs, shrimps, and people love eating those. So in the same way that somebody's going to take a shrimp and pick out some juicy protein from inside and eat it, why shouldn't we take the protein out from an insect?
Broadcaster Brian Foerd. Morning to you, Brian. Morning to you. Is that right? Am I talking through my hat, or is that true?
No, dear boy, through the mouth. It's
just a fleshy bit of the bottom part of the face. No, the point about it is, it's not
independent academic research. There was a kind of a little frisson of doubt about whether the verdict was right. A lot of people thought he'd been murdered. Several people rang me up, a couple of journalists and a couple of forensic specialists. I was sent the bare facts of the case. I was really asked as an outsider to present a sort of an objective view of what the evidence suggests.
What do you reckon?
Clinically, that's absolutely wonderful. I wouldn't say orgasmic on an afternoon breakup because it wouldn't be right, but that is a lovely, delicious, gorgeous wine.
Thank you for that, Brian. Thank you.
And said she was going to give a fervent demonstration that would convince everybody that you should never drink gin. And she put 2 glasses on the table and she said, one of these contains pure water and the other neat gin. And she picked up a little tin, an Altoids tin, throat capsules with little wriggly worms in, and dropped a worm into each glass. And she said, behold, the worm in the water is wriggling away as happy as Larry. The worm in the gin is dead. What lesson does that teach us? And the little voice in the back said, if you've got worms, drink plenty of gin.
But Brian, this book is full of useful information like that.
Useful?
No, it is. It's, as I say, passes the time. And I think it gets people interested in science. By the way, all the best with your new series on food on television. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian UJ Foerd.
Everybody here, goodbye.
As you'll gather from this set of closing credits, I also had a couple of series of my own television game show. You can be very pleased that I don't have time to bore you with some of those excerpts, but doing a game show was an unusual episode in my life and something I greatly enjoyed. Travel, of course, continued to be a part of the family's regular schedule. Here we are in Morocco some years ago when the kids were young. And meanwhile, of course, I continued to publish research. Much of it appeared in coloured articles, in magazines, in popular magazines and elsewhere, but there were also papers published in the scientific journals. And I have to say that one advantage of having been free from academic pressure is that I have been able to go from one subject to another. And you find that just when you get fed up with one subject, the one you move on to is one you've not considered for a year or two, and suddenly it's all fresh and new and bright again. And so many of these topics, which are quite deeply academic subjects, have proved to have interesting after effects once they've appeared in print in the journals. The question is, of course, does Brian keep a diary? The answer is no, but I did once keep a log of activities for 3 years.
I'm not sure that Brian keeps a diary, but he ought to. He doesn't.
No, he doesn't. But I had a 3-year fellowship, a bit like the MacArthur fellowships in the United States, from Leicester, and I had to put together reports on where I went and what I did and who I saw and the research that was done. And so this is just flipping through the original report. Looking at it now on the screen reminds me of a whole cavalcade of events I'd totally forgotten I'd ever done. But I met tens of thousands of people during those 3 years. I travelled to scores of countries, gave hundreds of lectures and lots of visits to laboratories. It really did fuel me for the future. It filled up my mind with inspiration from other scientists, from other cultures, from other lands, and from totally different, disparate disciplines from those in which I worked. And I have to say, those 3 years gave me the chance to concentrate on science, and I'm thrilled to bits that I was honoured by having that fellowship. The scheme no longer exists, which I think is a great shame. The report ended with this appendix, which showed some of the detailed log pages in which all my adventures had been listed. And the column I write now, you remember I began as a columnist, is for a scientific journal, The Microscope, published in the United States, and in it I deal with a whole raft of disparate topics, strange topics, unusual topics, controversial topics, but all of them looked at from the point of view of somebody who is fascinated by what living cells are doing, because now nobody seems to study very much, and the living cell is to me the key to understanding life. Whether it's COVID, or indeed a chance to look back at the forgotten woman scientists in the microscope field, who made major discoveries, who, because they were women, have been largely ignored by history. Dining has always been a pleasure. Here we are at Cambridge University at High Table. Here we are 40 years ago at Christmas time at home. Christmas dinners became a massive event in our house. This was the biggest one that we had some years ago, and the number of people who used to come got to be out of hand. And I said, no, we're too old for this now, so we don't do a Christmas dinner anymore, but we do a Christmas tea, which is much easier to arrange and enormous fun. It's usually on Boxing Day, or possibly the day after. And so that means that we have a chance for the family to come and get together with us and join with us in celebration, but without all the complexity of having to go to the trouble of actually cooking a meal. Lovely to see you all, and a very happy Christmas to everybody.
Happy Christmas.
There comes a time in life, ladies and gentlemen, when you need to step back from things you used to do before you get too old to do them properly. This is the house in which we now live. It's a thatched house in Cambridgeshire, and here we have the perfect opportunity to celebrate family events. As grandson George, celebrating his 18th birthday, the young man who took me back to Luxembourg on a surprise visit, that was really such a joy. George is now a teacher and something of a mathematical genius. He's been on TV to show off his mathematical skills. But al fresco meals and al fresco celebrations have always been a great part of how we like to live our lives. And we have a second garden at the bottom of which is a little summer house. And it's a tropical garden. We have palms, we have all sorts of exotica growing there, and so we can go down there to have lunch and almost imagine that we were somewhere in the tropics. We also grow fruit. We have apples, we have pears, we have apricots ripening. These were filmed just before I came away. Figs, we always get a massive crop of figs. And sitting down in the summer house and looking at the palm tree, you can always imagine that you were away in the tropics. That's always been, in my life, one of the most exciting things to do. Just to get away to go somewhere different, where the vegetation is different. And of course, meeting people on cruises. I often get people who say, thanks so much for your talks, they were great. What people don't realise is that on the cruises, I have met some of the most interesting people I have ever met. And I actually learned an awful lot from the passengers, from interacting with the passengers. They say the people on a cruise are like the people in real life. No, they're not. In real life, most people instinctively don't like being forced to meet other people, and most people do not feel comfortable in a culture that isn't their own. Cruise people, people like you, like to be challenged, like to have the thrust of novelty, like to be forced to assimilate other cultures and to meet people they wouldn't expect to meet. And so I have to say, really, my thanks to all the passengers I've met, because they have helped to make my cruise lectures as they are. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.